solution.
Invitation.
Deep resistance from a deep love.
Every time I come to accept the severity of the predicament, it's deeper, it's harder, it's more painful. And so it's not like I'm ever done. How do we not cause harm in a system as it's unraveling that promises to do more harm?
LaUra, welcome to Love in Action at Caapi Cottage in Dominica. So today we're going to be speaking with LaUra Schmidt, who is the founder, one of the founders of the Good Grief Network. And she's going to talk to us about the 10-step program, which helps people to cope personally and emotionally with the climate and ecological crisis. So LaUra, can you let people know a little bit about you, where you're based, who you are, and what your passion is?
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. I'm grateful to be here. I have a master's degree in environmental humanities and started really understanding the severity of the predicament and the overlapping crises about a decade ago, and started trying to figure out different ways that I could cope personally. I experienced life with CPTSD, and so I feel like I'm already predisposed to depression and anxiety, and knew that I would need some resilient strategies if I wanted to be a change maker and if I really wanted to look the crises square in the face, so to say. So yeah, I am really passionate about personal resilience strategies and how we can look at these really painful times without shutting down and without contributing more to the predicament. And with the help of my wife and co-founder, Amy Lewis Rowe, she really helped me model a framework that brings people together. We lean into the heavy and hard conversations, and we try to identify what meaningful action looks like on the other side of this deeply personal and communal journey. CPTSD is complex PTSD. So I have a lot of childhood trauma that was unresolved when I started waking up to the severity of the predicament, and very soon learned out that that's a quick recipe for burning out, is having compounded previous trauma and trying to look at something as big as the climate crisis intermixed with a ton of other social injustice issues, ecological breakdown, all of these complex overlapping systemic predicaments.
So before we get into the 10 steps, give us a sense of how you were inspired to create this program. What was your inspiration for, creating something that could help other people as well?
I created the program that I needed. My wife and I say that a lot, that we created the program that we needed. And it's because when I launched myself into activism, I realized that without personal resilience strategies, I'm going to burn out. And when I focused on my personal inner work, I realized that that's never going to affect change. And so somehow we have to do this dance of inner work and outer work, and it's best supported in community. When I was studying at the University of Utah for my master's program, I had a teacher named Terry Tempest Williams. She's an author and an activist, and she kept asking her students, what brings you alive? What brings you meaning? And she really helped me understand for the first time that what is most deeply personal to us affects the collective. And so I started looking at ways that I could sustain myself, that I could energize my passions for being an agent of change while keeping my heart open. And that's really hard in this world. We're constantly witnessing secondary trauma. And then in addition to that, we're seeing that the climate breakdown is happening now. And so some of us are experiencing firsthand trauma from the climate crisis and systems breakdown. And what I ended up doing was looking to the psychological research, to the sociological research, and then conducting some interviews for my graduate work, and ended up finding themes about how other people are preserving themselves so they can keep doing this hard work. And then I looked for a loop, I looked for a pathway forward, and put the patterns together and then created a framework. And it was really when Amy and I got together, she focuses on social justice. I was focusing on the environmental realm. And we realized that there's something deeper than those two problems. The same disconnection that allows us to hurt other people is the same disconnection that's allowing us to hurt the earth. And so if we can dig deeper to that core wound that exists and then start healing that in relationship, we can actually create some sort of transformation, personal and collective. And so Amy and I borrowed from Adult Children of Alcoholics, of which I'm a grateful member. And then we had the privilege of sitting with a lot of different types of facilitators and mapped the framework that I had envisioned for my graduate work into a step program where we work one step a week. And it really starts with accepting the severity of the predicament. It turns internal. And then by step 10, we're trying to focus on external work and reconnection and what life looks like, accepting the severity of the predicament, doing our inner work, and then bringing our connection into the world.
Wow, beautiful. Beautiful. That's powerful. And like you say, having that model from AA or Al-Anon, which is such a proven and powerful model to come into dealing with climate grief and healing. Can we dig a bit deeper into the actual steps themselves now that you've laid out sort of the overview of the program? Because I think it's really interesting how you've labeled or named each step and what happens in between. What are sort of the expectations for the group or the personal to get from one step to the next step? If we could go through that, that would be great.
Step one is accept the severity of the predicament. And what I really love about the containers we build is that when we're in session, we don't ever argue or disagree about what we believe the severity of the predicament to be. Everybody is welcome with how they perceive the predicament. And what we actually create space for is our emotional reaction to such a heavy topic. You know, we're sitting here having this conversation in a kind of removed fashion. But when we sit with what the climate crisis really means and ecological breakdown and social injustice and economic inequality, like this impacts our lives, it impacts our livelihoods. And so what we do is we create containers to not just talk about it in a distanced way. We really ask ourselves to open our hearts up and say, I am terrified to be alive right now. I have no idea what I can do as one person to even make a meaningful change in the world. And so we launch right into the conversation from the hardest part, which is how bad do you think things are? If you're wanting to enter into a support group, you're probably not able to continue business as usual. Something has happened in your life where your worldview has switched and you now are grasping for ways to be in this very destructive time.
So step 2 is uncertainty.
And we start talking about practicing being with uncertainty. I think in the dominant Western paradigm, we somehow came up with the notion that if we do all the right things, if we go to school and get the degree and have the family and have the job, that we can predict our lives and kind of control our lives. To be alive is to live with unpredictability. And so we kind of need to move away from the notion that we can control and predict and instead learn to be more nimble and learn to be more open as things change around us. And that way we're not so rigid in our expectations of what the world's going to look like.
And just even reflecting a little bit about where we are, you know, with the COVID pandemic, the uncertainty of being able to make plans, the uncertainty of being able to, you know, travel or see loved ones, that's obviously a really important step at this time. And how just, do you have any anecdotes for people, for recent groups that you've run during the pandemic, how that step has been helpful for people?
We were in the middle of a 10-step group when lockdown happened here in the United States. And my wife and I were co-facilitating a group, and you could see the night and day difference between the different types of steps that we were working on. So the step before the lockdown was deeply different than the step after lockdown happened. People were so emotionally dysregulated, like it felt like the floor had been pulled out from many of us. You know, we were living the uncertainty in our day-to-day lives, you know, not knowing if we're going to get this virus that may or may not kill us. It may kill the people we love. We can't do the things we used to do. We don't know what's safe anymore. It really threw so many question marks into the mix. Creating spaces in uncertain times means that we have to bring it back to an embodied connection, because otherwise it becomes too theoretical and we're not grounded enough to even be having heart-centered conversations. And so at that point, when lockdown happened, we realized we needed to start doing embodiment practices or journaling or some type of grounding practice to get people to arrive in the same place. If you look back over the last 2 or 3 years, we've had such unprecedented changes in our society. that if you're holding rigidly to business as usual, you have limited means to cope. Like we don't know how to cope if we can't embrace uncertainty. In the last 3 years, the world has been radically changed by so many things, including storms, the racial reckonings, the fires, the wildfires breaking out all over the world, and of course, coronavirus and the subsequent lockdown. 3 is honor my mortality and the mortality of all. And we used to call it confront my mortality. And we were in conversation with Michael Dowd, and he said, confront seems so aggressive. Like if we want to teach that mortality is a teacher, is an instructor, maybe we honor our mortality. And so we've changed the word of the step on a recommendation from Michael Dowd. And I think it's really important that we bring in conversations about the finite nature of our lives, of our planet, of our systems. Everything changes. We can't have these conversations about the deeply disorienting times that we're living in without addressing our mortality, without addressing death anxiety, and without noticing how we react if we're not having a healthy relationship and honoring the fact that we're all going to die, and then being able to still live fully, knowing that this will all end at some point.
Industrial consumer culture, we're a real death-denying culture, and other indigenous cultures or smaller local cultures have rituals for death and dealing with death and accepting it, and it's much more part of everyday life when we're sort of always pushing it away and denying it and focusing on youth and progress and forever.
Yeah, it's almost as if we have come to believe that dying is like a failure. We've not done something right if we die, instead of seeing it for the natural part of life that it actually is.
Stephen Jenkinson talks a lot about this, of course, and I really appreciate his perspective and teaching, on death and dying.
The next step is do inner work. And for me, I see this really as being a twofold invitation. The first one is to feel our full range of feelings. We always prioritize the fun, feel-good feelings at the expense of the ones that are harder to sit with. We avoid feelings like grief and fear and despair and hopelessness. And I think we're seeing this in a lot of the dialogue with activists right now as well, is like, oh, we can't go into the grief. We can't actually embrace the fear because we'll get stuck there. And so the first part of doing our work is, no, we absolutely have to feel those feelings so that we're not just stuffing them in our bodies and then becoming incredibly reactionary and disconnected. The second part of the do inner work journey is an invitation to clear our past traumas. We're living in a traumatized culture that perpetuates oppression and exploitation and trauma onto all types of people to different degrees. And so we're all coming with different types of trauma. And if we're not resolving it within ourselves, the further chaos that we're entering into, the more our trauma responses are going to be elicited, and the more disconnected and reactive we're going to be in that way too. So we need to feel our full range of feelings, and we need to clear what types of trauma and harm we're coming into these spaces with, so that we can actually open to things like new ideas and connection and nuance. And we have to teach them that by the end of this 10-step journey, you're not going to be cured. You're not going to feel grief. You're not going to be in despair. You're not going to feel fear. These are really despairing, fearful, grief-filled times. But instead, you develop a relationship with them so that when grief comes back, you're not inundated by grief. You instead recognize grief is here. Oh, I know how to handle grief. I have tea with my grief. I honor it. I create space for it. What we do in these spaces is really try to teach people how to reorient to their feelings.
That's the way you've articulated it is really helpful, because, in our culture, there aren't many safe spaces where people can feel. And a lot of people have shut down their feelings to cope. That's how people, and especially children, cope with trauma, is to separate from your feelings. And so for people who have lived through trauma or a lot of difficulty, they are very shut down. So you must see that in your groups, and to have a safe place for them to start to just feel again is really a big transition for a lot of people, I'm sure.
In full transparency, this is the work of my time and of my life. When I first entered into this space, I'd had a ton of childhood trauma. I'd lost two of my best friends within 1 year, and it was just too much for me to cope with. And I was bragging to my friends that I hadn't felt anything in a decade. And when I entered into this space, when I realized how reactionary I was and how I was just muting everything. And theorists like Brene Brown teach us that you can't selectively mute emotions. And so trying to avoid my own grief and my own pain, I was also muting my joy and my pleasure. And I was living like a really, I keep wanting to say the word muted, but I want a better word. I was living a diminished life. Mm-hmm. And I realized that if we're going to live in a time of ongoing crises, it doesn't serve me to be emotionally muted. It serves me to experience joy and connection and relationship. And those are the kinds of things that keep us alive.
Can you give us an idea of your typical group, age range, and background? Who comes to you for these programs?
The people who enter into this space self-select to enter into this space. I think the same is probably true for deep adaptation. You know, we feel this stirring in us and we want to connect and we want to see who else is willing to look at the predicament. We have a far-reaching age range. People, I think our youngest participant was 13, but we're not focusing on youth and children right now. We're primarily focusing on college age. And then our oldest participant, I think, was 85. And she called in. She didn't Zoom. She just, dialed on her phone to participate. And then I expected to see a lot of activists, like burned out activists, people who needed inspiration. And what we're seeing is that people come from all types of backgrounds. And I think it's been really empowering to witness that we have a stay-at-home dad next to a 60-year activist veteran who is burning out. We have a landscaper. We have a photojournalist. We have like people from all types of disciplines and walks of life and with regard to how they spend their days. But we're also noticing that these spaces are predominantly white. We have very little racial diversity in it, and we're missing entire demographics of people who have been experiencing systems of oppression and the people who have had to answer the question of how do we live in systems of oppression and exploitation. Those voices are largely missing from our circles. And so we're having to reel back and ask really hard and important questions of how do we become more inclusive? Like what kinds of frames are we coming into these spaces with and what kind of assumptions work? How do we include the people who really need this work instead of just the people who are privileged enough to find this work? And that's been, I think the whole climate emotions sphere is having to reckon with that question right now. And then the safety of the container. If the group is predominantly looks all like one type of person, how is the person who doesn't look like that going to feel safe and included? How do we create language of I want to be very careful with this because I think it's really important that we not perpetuate the harm in these spaces. And so for many of us that are in these white dominant spaces, we're having to deconstruct a lot of our own ways that we're talking and our own assumptions about the world and what resilience means and the types of harm that has been caused in these types of spaces. And so we're actively trying to do that as a team. We're actively trying to reach out and decolonize our minds and hearts so that we can be a real, true, brave, emergent space that we want to be. And it's not easy. And I think that these spaces like Good Grief and deep adaptation, if we create a container that's hard enough or sturdy enough to hold the harm that we have created and that has been perpetuated by these systems of injustice, we can actually create real transformation and not just the head nod transformation, which brings me actually to the next step, which is step 5. And that's developing awareness of biases and perception. And in these spaces, we like the easy entry point is talking about cognitive biases. It's talking about all the ways that our brains are wired to take shortcuts and kind of give us the information that we want instead of the real information. But the bigger question of this step is really, what stories are we telling ourselves about the way that the world is? What stories have we grown up with that until we question, and we'll talk about this in step 8, but the stories that live in us, and until we question them, we keep perpetuating them. and oftentimes without even an awareness that they're being perpetuated. And it's the notion that we all live with these like lenses on our eyes, and how do we start peeling back the lenses so we can see reality as reality is. Usually people will just say what's on their heart and their mind, and then you'll get this like story from a participant who isn't ready to sit with a hard truth yet. And so you'll hear a story about them talking about taking their dog for a walk or something. And so it can be really sort of benign or, you know, kind of easy to talk about. But the power of this group dynamic is that that person's still sitting in a space with 12 other people coming from their I statements. And so they get to kind of try on what LaUra thinks, or like how LaUra sees the world. And does that fit with my worldview? Am I ready to try on something new? The facilitators really are there to help people get in their bodies so that we're not reactionary when we're in these conversations with each other. And then making sure that, you know, the space is not dominated by one or two voices, but really we just kind of explore the idea of what is it like for you in this time and space to be exploring something like you're wearing so many lenses. How do you start peeling those lenses? How do you start peeling those lenses back? Step 6 is practice gratitude, witness beauty, and create connection. And all three of these are resilient strategies available to us all the time. But gratitude is really about noticing what's still here and not focusing on all the things that have been taken away or lost. And so it's a mind frame shift, you know, like even in the most dire of circumstances, we can find one thing that is beautiful. And I think that if we're to survive this reordering of the world that we're undergoing right now, that we really need to engage in noticing what's still here, noticing growth, like witnessing connection and what's worth holding on to. Step 7 is take breaks and rest. Take breaks and rest is not something that we're very good at in the dominant Western paradigm. We live in a capitalistic culture that tells us that we need to compete and that our time is only as valuable as the money we can make from selling our time. And yet we know full well that if we're not taking breaks and resting, we're going to burn out. We're going to start to personally crumble. And if we want to prevent that crumbling, we have to take breaks. And we often use the analogy of a choir and say, if I am a part of a choir, I'm never singing the whole melody by myself. In fact, sometimes I'll sing a note and sometimes I'll take a rest. And that's when another community member raises their voice and contributes to the melody. And so I am not responsible for holding the song by myself.
Yes, and I was just thinking that a lot of people don't have a community, you know, where they can actually give and take and share time and responsibilities with. So it probably brings up a lot for people to say, well, you know, I don't have a partner, or I don't have a group that can, you know, can help me with these tasks or with my day-to-day. So it is about also rebuilding those communities is really critical to be able to take breaks and take care of yourself and each other.
Yeah, we can't take breaks without the support of community. And so then the question becomes, how do we start creating community so that we can take breaks? Like the dominant culture just perpetuates this myth that we can do everything on our own, or that we ought to be able to do everything on our own. And it's so isolating. I mean, there's no coincidence that our rates of depression in the westernized world are just off the charts and increasing every year. And we're seeing it in younger and younger demographics too. And it's because this myth of isolation has been perpetuated, and it is just breaking us. In no culture before these industrialized colonial cultures did we have such extreme isolation. We lived in tribes, we lived in communities, we supported each other, we helped raise each other's kids, you know, we danced together, we told stories. Those kinds of things have been sold to us as like extra, like not worthy of pursuing, because money and buying things is more important.
Mm-hmm. You know, as the scale of the crisis accelerates, people realize we're going to need community in the days ahead. to
absolutely. Well, and what comes up a lot in these next few steps, the take breaks and rest and the show up and the community orientation, is exactly the question that you posed. How do we create community if we've been so estranged from community? How do we relate to people again? How do we even find people to be in community with us? We know that if your house floods, or if there's a fire, or if there's a Category 5 storm, that it's not going to be the politician, on the other end of the country or the state that has your back. It's going to be the people next to you. And so how do we start locally creating communities where, like, you don't have to like everybody, but you can love people, you can, give people the benefit of the doubt, you can cooperate with people, so that if you can't afford your monthly bills, we have this program where people can help each other out. We really need to figure out ways to move away from this individualization and this alienation and this isolation into mutual aid and taking care of each other. Because again, when these disasters happen, it's not going to be the politician that comes and saves you and helps you rebuild your house. It's going to be your next door neighbor, and it's going to be the people that are in a close proximity to you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very powerful that you're focusing on that.
Step 8 is grieve the harm I have caused. And this is one of the hardest steps that we have to deal with. And it really is a reckoning with the fact that we live in cultures of oppression and cultures of extraction. Just by existing, we're doing some amount of harm. And our level of harm changes depending on the bodies that we're born in and the ways that we live our lives and the decisions we make. But step 8 is to really sit with the notion that we're all harm doers and that we're all harm receivers. And that once we can start asking some questions about the stories we're told, the less harm we can start doing. But we have to be aware of them first. We have to grieve the fact that we're harm doers. And for some of us, like, depending on our level of marginalization, we do different levels of harm. And I think the important thing here with the grieving of the harm is that we have to slow down enough to feel that. And it's excruciating. And so we try to hold that space. We try to hold that space for people on whatever level of reckoning that they're doing, in hopes that we start questioning our norms, start questioning our decisions, start questioning our level of privilege, so that we can start actually coming together and stop othering people. How do I stop perpetuating harm from neoliberalism, from racism, from colonialism? How do I start deconstructing that?
Wow, that's a powerful one. I can see how that could be difficult for a lot of people. We're not ready to look at that.
What is fascinating is people still attend to the honor my mortality less than the grieve the harm I've caused. like our fear of mortality seems to be a little bit deeper. We can sit with the harm we've caused so long as it's slow, and it's really interesting. There's a lot of pushback between those two steps and being able to sit with it, because it requires us to turn inward and deal with things that we don't want to see. Being faced with the notion that we're all harm doers just by the very system that we live in and by the decisions we make, like that's huge. That's huge. The next step 9, is about showing up. And showing up is important in a lot of different ways, but we show up for ourselves with boundaries so that we can better show up for our community. To determine what is a healthy level of boundaries, we try to determine what showing up actually looks like, so that we can be active agents in our local community and help other people.
So the last and final step is?
The last and final step is reinvest into meaningful efforts. And we make this one really vague and non-prescriptive on purpose. And it's because we believe that all of the people coming into these spaces have their own unique skills, experiences, and passions. And when you're pursuing your unique intersection of skills, passions, and experiences, and I'm showing up with mine, that we can identify different places that are going to be meaningful and generative. In a time as tumultuous as what we're living through right now, I think those are great guides to help us know what the next best step is. That's our program. So we do one step a week for 10 weeks. And by the end, hopefully there has been an internal transformation in each of our participants. And the goal is that, like classic AA programs or Al-Anon programs, you don't actually work one step a week. This is the transformation happens outside of the rooms, and the rooms become a place of accountability and for showing up in that community support. But really, each one of these steps has to be taken back into your own personal life and grappled with and struggled with and worked through. And, you go back a step and you move forward a step, but it's really just a spiral. Every time I come to accept the severity of the predicament, it's deeper, it's harder, it's more painful. And so it's not like I'm ever done.
I wanted to ask you about the feedback. If you, especially from young people who go through this, millennials, so we're talking about people in their 20s and 30s, what has been some of the most powerful or unexpected feedback that you've had from people that have gone through the program?
The most beautiful piece of feedback I received was in a step 10. We're about to wrap up, and one of our participants said something along the lines of, "I feel like I'm fully living with my heart open for the first time." And it was such a gift to hear that. Like, the world is such a scary, painful place that our animal instinct, is to respond with our fear responses or our trauma responses. And it's to contract and get small and go into self-protection mode. And to hear the feedback that people are willing to live open-heartedly. If we're going to make it through this transition time as a species, it's because those of us who are willing to exhibit courage and open-heartedness and connection. It's not going to be from the ones who get really small and scared and hurt other people. But a lot of the things that surprise us are the sadness that the program is ending. It shows a real desperation to be seen in our daily lives. We're only together for 10 weeks. And when that wraps up, how do we reintegrate into our real lives? What are we bringing back into our real lives? And how do we start creating community at this level with our families and with our friends and with the people around us, so that it's not just this digital holdover that we're mourning the loss of after 10 weeks, not just in good grief spaces, but in a lot of the spaces. We build these beautiful containers, and they're inspired and courageous and all of the things that we want to model for a future world that, as this current world unravels. And yet, how do we keep that container in the world that's falling apart?
It's a critical part of this is sort of what are the next steps after the 10 step. And I heard in an interview that you and Amy had done about creating a facilitator's manual or a guide, so that some people could go through, learn how to facilitate the program, and then take it back into their own community, maybe and do an in-person facilitation with people to start to build community, that way. Is that one of the focus, and what would that look like, a facilitator program?
So one of our goals is to create an affiliate training program. We're in the process of doing that. Good Grief Network is not a conventionally funded nonprofit. And so most of the time we're working as volunteers, and it becomes very hard to continuously put out materials and create things if you're not fiscally secure. And so that's been a real struggle for us. For a long time, it was just me and my wife. And now we have a third core team member, Sarah Jornsey Silverberg, who's really helping us. But everything is much slower than we want it to be for a number of reasons. One of which is also we're like dealing with this inner work of living in times of great unraveling and trying to grapple with all of the losses in our own personal grief and things like that, and trying to create a sound enough program that when we train affiliate facilitators to bring this program back into their own communities, it's a sound enough container to be able to have radical transformation of the heart and of the mind. And the main thing people don't understand about spaces like this is we're not here to fix each other. And it's really hard in this fix-it, solution-oriented culture to sit with each other in our despair and in our grief without offering some sort of solution or rushing to try to fix. And so we've realized that the core of our training has to be focused on the be with and don't fix aspect of the program. And that's a really hard thing to train people how to do.
You were talking about stable sources of funding so that you can do the work. I noticed you have a Patreon page. Are there grants that you apply for? Are there any small business or for NGOs in your area, or what do you look at for supporting the work that you do? And also tuition. Do participants pay a tuition fee?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, my wife and I do have a Patreon account, and then we do take donations in the United States. We're a 501c3, so they can be tax-free donations. And then we do ask program cost for compensating our facilitators, and then, of course, bringing some back into the network in hopes of compensating ourselves to be able to continue to do this work. We have had one generous grant in the 5 years of operation, but we're finding that we're not very eligible for funding because we tend to be a bit critical of the established institution. But the notion is that we have a sliding scale program cost available. We always want to make sure things are accessible. I grew up in poverty. I've been impoverished most of my life. And so it's really important to me that we keep our prices at an affordable rate. We have a scholarship program. And I still live in a capitalistic paradigm where I need to pay my bills and like eat and, basic things like that.
What is the average cost, would you say, for the 10-week program? What sort of does it start at? Or
it's a sliding scale between $200 and $500 that we ask for 10 weeks. And we have a facilitation team of 2. So we think it's a pretty good deal to be able to do that much sort of emotional labor and navigating with 2 facilitators and creating the container. And we keep our groups small on purpose. Our groups are maxed out at about 15 people. We've been experimenting with kind of the special spot or special group size. And it's anywhere between about 8 and 15 people where we really see some personal transformation occurring. The strength of our program is that we're a peer-to-peer support network. So while we've trained facilitators, we're not mental health professionals.
Just before we close, I just wanted to turn a little bit to the framework of deep adaptation. And I don't know if you've had a chance to go through the 4 R's, which Jem Bendell has suggested that these could be tools for how we deeply adapt, to this predicament. So from resilience, relinquishment, restoration, and reconciliation. Would you say that your program addresses any one of these or all of these, or what resonates for you with in terms of the 4 R's, or does it resonate?
The 4 R's seem like a really poignant, concise way to have us evaluate our priorities as human beings and as a community, and the types of things we have to let go in times of deep transition. And I like it. I mapped it out in relation to the 10 steps. And I realized that relinquishment for deep adaptation, letting go of certain assets, behaviors, or beliefs is a lot like our understanding that we're operating with cognitive biases and perception, and that we're navigated by the stories we tell ourselves. Restoration is really about reconnecting. And that's what we talk a lot about in our 10-step framework, is how do we reconnect to ourselves? How do we heal ourselves? How do we reconnect to others in the world at large? How do we restore these relationships? If we look at the climate crisis and a lot of these other compounding crises, they're problems of broken relationships and problems of disconnection. And so anything that moves us towards restoration or connection by nature is healing. And then reconciliation is interesting because it's like, how do we live knowing what we know? How do we not cause harm in a system as it's unraveling that promises to do more harm? How do we present ourselves internally and with our communities so that we can navigate this world and really funnel that invitation to reconnect and to be inspired and to lead with meaning and joy? And so I think that there's a lot of parallels between the two. The 4 R's almost is like a sexier version because it's so concise, and it's just like, this is what it is. How does that framework get mapped into the world? How do we practice that? I'd like to see how the deep adaptation addresses the 4 R's in practicality, because otherwise what the struggle here is creating a theory and bringing it back into practiced and lived reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's what the forum tries to invite people into, share their practices and their programs and projects that actually are living embodiments of resilience and restoration and these kinds of things. But it's a community it's still unfolding and evolving. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes in the months and years ahead. But yeah, I can certainly see a lot of a crossover between what you're doing with Good Grief and the Deep Adaptation Network.
Yeah. Well, and the one thing that seems really pertinent right now and in this time of transition is, how do we be nimble? How do we allow space for evolution? And as we learn more about the way the world changes and about what it means to be a human being alive in this time, like, how do we start reorienting the stories we've told ourselves from our youth? You know, those of us who, I think the young people get it more than those of us that are a little bit older, because we've been so indoctrinated by the systems. But we kind of have to just open everything up and see what is fundamentally true in an ecological sense, in a healing sense, in a relational sense. And like, what stories are we just perpetuating because we were told these stories? And I think that whether we're doing it through Deep Adaptation or Good Grief Network or the work that reconnects, like, we just have to be doing the work, you know?
Well said. Well said. Well, this series is called Love in Action, and I really feel you know, we're looking for people that are using their love and putting it into actions and programs and activities. And does that resonate with you?
Yeah, actually, the title and your approaching email, the Love in Action invitation, I was like, I don't have much time right now. This is a busy time of year for many of us, but it means a lot. And I feel very fortunate to be invited on this call. And we've labeled Good Grief Network as the Heart-Centered Revolution. And it's because we want to lead with our hearts open and we want to connect. And in the spaces that we've cultivated, I have seen such revolutionary transformation and open-heartedness that before I started doing this work, I had little hope for humanity. And then you start realizing that we're not actually destructive. Our stories are destructive. We're actually really beautiful, and we're connective, and we're like geniuses in our own right. Like, we just have to harness it for good and for connection and for inspiration and courage, and not for like extraction and money. So I think part of the heart-centered revolution, or Love in Action, is really about appealing to the nature of humanity and never losing hope in that ability to connect, and that ability to be inspired and pursue meaning and joy.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, LaUra, for sharing all of this.
We've had a lot of time with you, and I really am grateful for that.
Thank you, Jessica. And thank you for your questions and your heart-centeredness.